Hello and welcome back, my dear students, once again to your YouTube channel. In today's video, I shall be discussing a poem from your ICSE syllabus, and this one is called A Considerable Speck, written by Robert Frost, and this one is from your book Treasure Chest, a collection of ICSE poems and short stories. But before I begin, you know what's coming up next? Yes, if you have been finding my videos really helpful and interesting, kindly do not forget to give me a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. It shall keep me motivated. Alright, so without further ado, let's get started. I am on page 46 of your treasure chest about the poet. Second paragraph of About the Poet. A Considerable Speck by Robert Frost is a wonderfully graphic description, graphic as in detailed, description of intelligence in action. What is this intelligence in action? I'll explain. The subject of the poem is an almost invisible mite, a little insect, which the poet narrator discovers on a sheet of paper. The opening lines of the poem are an account of the mite's panic and its frantic efforts to run across a page of writing in a futile attempt to evade the narrator. So, survival of the fittest, the theme of survival of the fittest. The narrator, the poet, had written a few words or perhaps a few sentences on a sheet of paper, and there had been a mite on the paper, a small little insect. And the insect was desperately trying to evade the ink, or rather the nib of the pen of the writer, in order to survive. So even the tiniest of creature has its intelligence, and which it is employing to evade its death. So this is the intelligence in action. It is only when the mite moves that the narrator realizes that the speck is a living mite. Till then, until the mite had started moving, it was thinking that it is a speck of dust. But then when it started moving, the poet realized that it is a living entity. Once he realizes that it is intelligent, he follows its desperate actions with interest. The poet goes on to explain the reason why the narrator chooses to save the life of the mite. So, respect for the individual, respect for the entity. Alright? The poem can be seen as a perfect illustration of what Albert Schweitzer called a reverence for life. Alright? So, this is very important from your exam's point of view. Alright? So, without further ado, let's get into the poem. A Considerable Speck by Robert Frost. A speck that would have been beneath my sight on any but a paper so white set off across what I had written there. So, you see, the speaker introduces the speck, emphasizing on its insignificance. Very important. When we will discuss the title, I will show you why the poet chooses this title, A Considerable Speck, consciously. He says, a speck that would have been beneath my sight. Something that would have been beneath my sight. He's specifically mentioning. Why? Because he is emphasizing on the fact that the speck, the mite, was so small that it seemed to be insignificant. It seemed to be too insignificant to be noticed. On any but a paper sheet so white, set off across what I had written there. So the poet or the narrator had written a few lines or a few sentences there. And the mite was desperate in its attempt to evade those sections, okay, in order to save its life. So what's the setting of the poem? The setting of the poem is a sheet of paper. Very unusual. Now, this has a biblical reference also, children. All right. Now, you see, in the story of creation, according to the book of Genesis, God created the universe from almost nothing. All right. And here we have the white sheet on which the destiny of the mind would be written. Set off across what I had written there. And I had idly poised my pen in air to stop it with a period of ink. And I, so the narrator, had idly poised, just like that, poised his pen in the air, held up his pen in the air. Why? To stop it, to stop the movement of the mind with a period of ink, a punctuation mark. All right. Now, this period of ink, literally I told you it's a punctuation mark, but this period of ink also has a biblical reference. It refers to the time period of 40 days flood that wiped out the entire civilization during the time of Noah. All right. So you see, the poem is replete with biblical references. When something strange poised my pen, let me remind you, poised my pen is a figure of speech, alliteration. And here again, we have when something strange, alliteration. When something strange about it made me think. So the movement of the mind made the poet conscious. This was no dust spake by my breathing blown again, alliteration, but unmistakably a living mind with inclinations it could call its own. So something strange about it made me think. The strange movement about the mind made the poet realize that, or made the poet conscious that it is not just a speck of dust. Initially, what did he think about the speck? That it was not speck of dust by my breathing blown. From the breath, it did not come. It was not any piece of dust that was blown because of the poet's breath. Here, breathing blown again has a biblical, the biblical reference. What does it imply? Now, in the Bible, we've been told, according to the book of Genesis, God created human beings from dust and breathed life into them. All right. So this could be the reference. But unmistakably a living mind with inclinations it called its own. It could call its own. So the movement of the mind made the poet realize, made the poet conscious that it was trying to evade those marks of ink in order to save itself. This is the intelligence in action. All right. It paused as with suspicion of my pen, and then came racing wildly again. So it paused. It took a pause and then started moving again to where my manuscript was not yet dry. There was no, the poet had written probably with fountain pen, where the ink had not dried up till then. Okay. Then paused again and either drank or smelt with loathing, for again it turned to fly. You see, Robert Frost, it's known for its description. Robert Frost is known for his meticulous description of things. And here we have visual imagery about the movement of the mind, how the mind moved. See, it paused as with suspicion of my pen. How detailed observation has been made by the narrator. To where my manuscript was not yet dry, then paused again, vivid description. And either drank or smelled, the poet was not very sure. With loathing, for again it turned to fly. Plainly, with an intelligence I dealt. So, see, the poet is acknowledging that it is not just any living creature. It is an intelligent living creature. In other words, he is associating the human-like attributes with this tiniest of creature. Plainly with an intelligence I dealt. So again a biblical reference. When God created man, he accepted as well as appreciated man's free will and his intelligence. The poet also acknowledges the free will and intelligence of the tiny creature. It seemed too tiny to have room for feet, yet must have had a set of them complete. To express how much it didn't want to die, it ran with terror and with cunning crept. So the poet is acknowledging, the narrator is acknowledging that it was such a small insect that it felt strange to realize that that tiniest of creature could also have a full set of legs. Okay. And then a full set of feet. But definitely it had, otherwise it wouldn't have been moving so fast. And not only that, it expressed how much it didn't want to die. The basic instinct of survival of the fittest. It was making desperate attempts, desperate pleas to survive. It ran with terror, it was getting feared, it was getting scared, and with cunning crept. Cunning crept again is your alteration. So the survival instinct of the mind is being highlighted. Why? To show that the signs of fear and the desperate attempts to survive is very much present even in the tiniest of creature. It faltered. I could see it hesitate. Then, in the middle of the open sheet, cowered down in desperation to accept whatever I accorded it of fate. So, it tried desperately to escape, but when it realized that it is a futile attempt, it slowly accepted its fate. It slowly accepted, it accepted whatever the narrator would do to it. Okay, so here we see the narrator or the poet assuming the godlike stature. Like God, decides the fate of individuals. Here we see the mind is giving that godlike stature to the poet or the narrator and lets him decide the fate of the mind. I have none of the tenderer than thou collectivistic regimenting love with which the modern world is being swept. This is very interesting. This tenderer than thou is actually an adaptation of holier than thou phrase. Okay. Here he says, the poet is saying, I have none of that tenderer than thou. Tenderer, gentler than you attitude in me. Neither do I have this collectivistic regimenting love with which the modern world is being swept. The speaker, the narrator, is accepting that he is not one of those individuals who is going to, regulate his empathy based on what others might think. That he's not being empathetic towards the smallest of creature. He is not a good man. The speaker says, no, I'm not one of those who is going to be easily influenced by what society thinks of him or what society would approve of him. I am what I am. Okay. Now, this collectivistic regimenting love concept is actually a modern ideology which stems from the idea of communism. All right. Communism believes in the theory of equality, and therefore, there is this tendency to attach importance to the speck, the tiniest of creature. But what the poet is saying, he's not saying that he's against communism. He is saying he is not one of those individuals who would be easily influenced and guided and manipulated by what society thinks of him. Okay. And then he goes on to say, with which the modern world is being swept. So it's a quite popular idea in the modern world that you have to have this holier than thou attitude in you. You have to have this tenderer than thou attitude in you. I'm not one of those, he clearly tells. And then says, but this poor microscopic item now, since it was nothing I knew evil of, I let it lie there till I hope it slept. Because the poet says, he rather acknowledges that he has no reason to harm it. Alright. And therefore, he is letting the speck lie where it is, so that the speck can go away when it fits, when it feels that it can. So, in other words, the poet is trying to acknowledge his own consciousness as well as the intelligence of the speck. He's acknowledging the intelligence of the speck, that it tried desperately to evade the ink. And only when it got tired, realizing that it is a futile attempt, did it stop. So it was the intelligence in action which the poet acknowledges. And now he says, because I have no personal cause or personal grudge to harm him, or rather, the speck has done me no harm, so why should I harm it? Not because of the holier than thou attitude or collective regimenting of love attitude I have in me. So that is why I am letting the speck be where it is. I have a mind myself and recognize mind. When I meet with it in any guise is form, no one can know how glad I am to find on any sheet the least display of mine. He says that it gives me immense pleasure to see that this intelligence is present in all individuals, irrespective of this shape and size. This is an enjambment, of course. I have a mind myself and recognize mind when I meet with it in any guise, in any form. It gives me immense happiness to acknowledge that intelligence exists in all creature, in all forms, in all figures. No one can know how glad I am to find on any sheet the least display of mind. Whenever there is intelligence, it really appeals to me. Alright. So that's the poem, my dear. It's a quite different one from the ones that you've been reading till now. Let's quickly look at the themes of the poem. The first theme of the poem is, of course, respect for life and life forms. Okay. The poet's change in perception or shift in perspective occurs only when he sees the intelligence in action of the tiny speck, tiny creature. Okay. And it awakens the consciousness in the mind of the poet that even the tiniest of creature has intelligence and therefore deserves respect, and therefore the theme of respect for life and life forms comes in. The second theme is, of course, empathy. We should be empathetic towards each and every individual. Mind you, there is a thin difference between sympathy and empathy. Alright? Sympathy is when you are not on the same boat or not on the same page with the other person. You are sympathetic to him because the other person you are considering is at a much lower height from you in a different circumstance altogether, and therefore you feel sorry for the person. But when you share the grief of the other individual, thinking that you are one of them who is in that trouble or that condition, then it is empathy. Alright? The third theme is observation and reflection. By observing the movement of the mind, there was a shift in the perspective of the speaker and the narrator. And most importantly, the next theme is intelligence and consciousness. That's the fourth theme. Intelligence and consciousness. Intelligence of the mind and awakening of the consciousness of the poet or the speaker. The fifth theme is, of course, existentialism, the survival of the fittest. The mind, despite being such a minuscule object, living entity, makes desperate attempts to survive. And finally, the last theme is the significance of the insignificant. Even though it appears to be a small dot, the insect, but it causes a shift in the perspective of the narrator, making the narrator conscious of respecting different forms of life. So, significance of the insignificant. With this, we come to the title of the poem, A Considerable Speck. The title of the poem, if you notice, is right. The first thing that you notice is that it is an oxymoron. Considerable speck. Considerable, something worth considering, and speck is something so insignificant that it cannot be considered. Yet they are placed side by side. So it's a juxtaposition of contradictory terms. Why? To show the significance of the insignificant. Therefore, the title right from the beginning sets out a philosophical idea. It shows how the insignificant mind causes a shift in the perspective of the poet, causes a shift in the paradigm, in the thinking space of the poet. Okay, so that is why the title of the poem is important and significant. Alright, so that's the poem, my dear students. I hope I've been lucid enough with my explanation. If you like this video, kindly do not forget to give me a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Also, do not forget to share the videos with your friend who might as well be benefited from this. See you in the next video really soon. Till then, take very good care of your health and goodbye.